Hello and welcome to today's WFRN VCS event, Gender, Work and Family in Turbulent Times, COVID-19, Remote Work and Diversity. I'm Jen Hook, WFRN's Vice President, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this virtual conference series on behalf of our leadership team, our President Ellen Galinsky, Executive Director Steve Sweet. I also want to acknowledge the generous support of the American Association for Retired Persons for our 2025 virtual conference series. A few things before we jump in. By joining us today, you're consenting to recording. The recording will be posted on WFRN's YouTube channel. I also want to acknowledge that events are made possible by the generous support of our members. If you're not a member yet or you need to renew, I encourage you to go to our website. And finally, I want to say a big thank you for joining us today, especially those of you who have been showing up routinely over the last few years. This is my last event as WFRN's Vice President, and I've absolutely loved the community we've built here together. But please be on the lookout for our next VCS events to be determined, which will be led by our incoming co-vice presidents, Katie Collins and Leah Rupenair. And with that, I'd like to introduce our organizer and moderator, who probably needs no introduction to this crowd, Jerry Jacobs, Professor of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania and the founding president of WFRN. Jerry is the author of 5 books, including classics we know and love, like The Time Divide with Kathleen Gerson and Revolving Doors. He's written over nearly 100 papers, just like maybe 1 or 2 more and hits the number. He's also a prolific editor and recently edited a special issue of Social Sciences on today's topic. And we'll hear more about that now. Over to you, Jerry.
Thanks, Jennifer, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here to our session today. The focus is going to be on the 12 papers that were published in the special issue on gender, work, and family during turbulent times. Basically what happened during the COVID period and what can we learn from that experience, and what can we learn in terms of how gender, work, and family are changing going forward. We're going to, I'm going to ask the speakers to be exceedingly brief. These are all fine, rich papers, but there are 12 of them. So in order to get through everything and have at least a little bit of time for discussion, we're really going to have to keep everything, exceedingly brief. So I'm going to interrupt the authors after 5 minutes. Hopefully I won't have to do that. I hate being a timekeeper. But I think you'll see there's a rich variety of papers. Styles are different. The settings are different. And so I think we all feel that we lived through COVID, and so we know what happened. But in fact, social science, as exemplified by these papers, can give us a sense not only of the variety of experiences in different contexts and different groups, but also commonalities. I'm gonna I'm just gonna introduce the speakers by name. Giving everybody's biography would take up most of the 5 minutes that they have allocated, so I really don't want to do that. We have links to the special issue. I'm going to be sharing, okay, I guess Dan is going to go first. And so he wants to share his screen, his slides. When nobody is putting their slides up, I'm going to be putting up the abstracts for the papers. Let's see, is there anything else I need to say at this point? So we've organized the discussion into 3 different topics. The first of which is housework and childcare. And the main question is, did fathers step up? What did we learn with respect to the evolution of gender roles in terms of fathers' contribution to housework and in particular in childcare as well? There are going to be 4 presentations in this area, and Dan Carlson is going first. So take it away, Dan.
Thank you, Jerry. Can everyone hear me okay? There's my email, in case you were curious as to what I was looking at this morning. Let me get this. Yeah, so first, thanks to Jerry for putting together this special issue and for putting together this uh, symposium, and thanks to Jennifer and WFRN for this series. So again, and before I start, I'd also like to thank my co-authors on this paper, Scott McPherson and Richard Petz. So during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, right, remote work became the new reality for many working adults and obviously many working fathers, and whether fathers would step up and contribute at home, however, especially in light of the loss of in-person school and childcare closures due to social distancing measures, was widely questioned. And you know, we questioned whether fathers would step up because research on the association between fathers' remote work and their domestic contributions is decidedly mixed. So the aim of this study, like, was to use data from Wave 1, which we collected in April 2020, of our study on U.S. parents' divisions of labor during COVID, to examine the association between fathers' remote work early in the pandemic and the performance of childcare, and the factors that may shape that association. And indeed, although time availability, perspectives would suggest that remote work would lead to increases in time flexibility for fathers and therefore more time for domestic labor. Contextual factors such as fathers' gender ideologies and mothers' employment status likely condition how fathers' remote work would be associated with their performance of childcare. And surprisingly, these moderating factors are rarely, if ever, considered in the research looking at this association. So on the one hand, gender ideologies likely affect how fathers perceive an increase in time availability, right, with more egalitarian-minded fathers being more inclined to use their job flexibility to do more domestic labor. On the other hand, increases in one's time availability are likely weighed relative to one's partner's time availability. And in different sex couples, mother's employment reduces their time availability relative to fathers. And as such, it's likely that fathers' remote work would be more strongly associated with their performance of childcare when mothers are employed and thus less available themselves to do childcare. Additionally, the moderating effect of gender ideology, we hypothesize, might be stronger in dual earning couples because there is less time for both partners to do domestic labor. And so gender ideology may carry more salience in deciding domestic responsibilities. So our analysis of 337 partnered fathers, all from different sex relationships, showed that fathers' average shares of childcare in their partnerships increased at the beginning of the pandemic. Indeed, 40% of fathers reported doing more childcare at the early days of the pandemic compared to before. And that is in contrast to only 4%, which reported doing less childcare overall. And we found this increase in childcare across both typically male, parenting tasks and female parenting tasks. We found that sole earning fathers were more likely than dual earning fathers to report an increase in childcare, but this is possibly just due to the fact that sole earning fathers were doing less childcare overall prior to the pandemic. Dual earning fathers, nonetheless, also increased their time in childcare during the pandemic and continued doing a larger share of childcare than their sole earning counterparts. Our multivariate regressions showed that the frequency of remote work was positively associated with the likelihood that fathers would do more childcare early in the pandemic. But among dual earning fathers only, we found that this association was stronger for those with egalitarian ideologies. So the association between remote work and child care performance was consistent for sole earning fathers. Didn't matter what the gender ideology was. But for dual earning fathers, those who were more egalitarian minded, remote work was more strongly associated with the probability of doing more childcare. And so just to give you some kind of sense of the magnitude here, for fathers in dual earning partnerships who had neutral gender ideologies, right, neither traditional nor egalitarian, there really was no association between the frequency of remote work and their childcare performance. Those who never worked from home had about a 9% probability of doing more childcare. Those who work from home exclusively had a 23% chance of doing more childcare. Among fathers who had somewhat egalitarian ideologies, if they were working from home exclusively, the probability of doing more childcare was 31%. And then amongst those who had entirely egalitarian ideologies, the probability was 41%. Now, of course, if you look at sole earning fathers there on the right, the green bar, those who work exclusively from home, they had the highest probability of doing more childcare at 43%. But of course, that probability of doing more is based on the fact that they weren't doing very much to begin with. And so this set of graphs shows you the share of childcare that fathers were doing. We used a scale here, it ranges from 0 to 4. You can think of every 1 point increase as about 25% share of childcare. So a value of 2 would be an even distribution of childcare responsibilities. So you see that, even if they were working from home exclusively, these sole earning fathers did, at best about 39% of the childcare. Dual earning fathers are doing more childcare regardless. But again, amongst those who are egalitarian, we see a much stronger positive association between frequency of remote work and their share of childcare. And indeed, for dual earning fathers who are egalitarian in their attitudes, who work from home exclusively, the model predicts that they were doing about 52% of the childcare overall, so an even distribution.
Okay, we really need to wrap it up, please.
Last slide. So, so the findings here are important because they highlight some of the factors that can lead to more equal distribution of childcare in families. More time availability may increase fathers' time and shares of childcare, but alone, it's insufficient really to produce equal divisions of childcare in families. Rather, it must be paired with fathers' motivations to use their flexibility, not just for leisure or to increase work productivity, but to be an equal partner. So without strong beliefs in gender equality and the time to follow through on those beliefs, dual earner, different sex families continue to default to mothers performing the majority of childcare. Yet when fathers have both the time and the desire to contribute equally, the results show that they do. So overall, then, in a post-pandemic environment where remote work is more widely available and also potentially less stigmatized, it appears that fathers that want to take on a larger share of domestic responsibilities might finally have the opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Great. We really need to keep things short. My suggestion would be if you could toss the theory and just share the results, I think that might try to expedite things, because otherwise we're not going to get to the last 6 or 7 papers, and that would be terrible. Our next presenter is Barbara Rissman. Are you handling the sticky gender paper, or is Kathleen Gerson doing that?
Kathleen's going to do that one.
Yeah,
okay,
hi, Jerry.
take it away, Kathleen.
Yes, this is me, and
please be concise.
absolutely, I am not necessarily known for being concise, but I am going to really try my best. So let's give it a shot. The clock is running. So just to give you an introduction, this paper is part of a larger collaborative effort with so many people that then you'll be hearing from today, and I won't mention them all now. That'll use up my time. But I do want to stress that the main authors of this paper are Michelle Serra and Golda Kaplan, who are graduate students at NYU, and Barbara Rissman and I worked carefully with them. very quickly, and then following up on what Dan had to say. Our interest in this the data set, by the way, is based on interviews, in-depth interviews that were collected from a national sample of people who had responsibility for some form of caregiving during the pandemic. This paper is based on couples in particular, and it's based on 80 interviews with 81 heterosexual couples, dual earner couples, and how they managed the balance of work and care. The questions we wanted to answer is very similar to Dan's, which is, did the pandemic and all of the changes it brought about increase or decrease or simply persist in the generally prevalent unequal division of labor between heterosexual couples in the home? We started by asking what people's baseline perceptions were of these arrangements, and there we found, not surprisingly, a gender divide. Almost half of the men we interviewed said that the divide was, division of labor was equal, barely a tenth, slightly more than a tenth, I should say, of the women agreed with that assessment. Among those who did say their balance was egalitarian, there was great satisfaction. On the other side of that equation, most of the women, close to 90%, described the pre-pandemic arrangement as unequal. About half of the men agreed with them. And there, the men were more likely than the women to express satisfaction, although 40% were dissatisfied, and only about a third of the women were. So what happened when the pandemic unfolded? The first thing to say is that those who claimed egalitarian arrangements remained quite satisfied. And not surprisingly, the pandemic allowed them both to sustain that arrangement and even solidify it. The more interesting question is what happened among the inegalitarians. And they reported little change despite the increase in caregiving demands and the increase in the ability to share, because many of them, of those workers, were likely to be at home. Most of those men did not desire change, but 25%, a good quarter of that group of men, did desire change. Among the women, almost 60% desired change. So far more than the men, and a notable assessment. The question that really we felt was most interesting in this data set, where the larger finding is little change occurred, despite the possibility for change, which is very important. But there is another story here, a more uplifting story that we also want to stress. And that is, among that small group of men and women who had an unequal division, but wished to have a more equal division, what was it that made it possible? I'm sorry, among the group who wished to have a more equal division, despite having an unequal division, a small group, slightly more than 10% of this group, including men and women, were able to achieve more equality. So yes, it's a small group, but the question is, how were they able to overcome the obstacles that create this quote unquote sticky gender that we're addressing? And here we found what was important here was that those couples who already desired a more equal egalitarian arrangement and were dissatisfied were able also were able to enjoy changes such as the rise of remote work, which left both of them at home and with more flexibility on how they did things. That the small group was able to put their ideals into practice. Again, it's a small group, but it's a theoretically important group, because it tells us something about the link between institutional arrangements and ideological ideals. And so the theoretical takeaway, if Jerry will excuse me for talking a little bit about theory, because I do think this is important, the theoretical takeaway is this: gender is sticky, even among those who would like more equality. It's extremely difficult to create it. And obviously but the main point is, among those who do wish for more equality, and that is a substantial proportion of men and women, if the arrangements become more compatible to their ideals, then they are able to move closer to the desires that they wish. And so our takeaway here is that in the debates about what causes the persistence of gender inequality, there's always this debate about culture and structure, culture and institutional organizations. And our argument is that when the institutional arrangements change, even in ways that are very disruptive and disconcerting, if those institutional changes allow for more equality, allow for more flexibility, then people are able to implement their more egalitarian aspirations. And if we want to create a world in which the ideals that increasing numbers of people hold, then our focus should be on changing the institutions so that they can implement those ideals. That's our conclusion, and I want to stress that I am not alone in this, but with my co-authors as well.
Thanks, Kathleen, for your concise presentation. We very much appreciate it.
I have no idea how much.
Our next presenter is Professor Ting Wang from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share some slides. I promise very, very concise. So can you see the slides? So I'm very happy to share my study on the housework reallocation between genders and the generations during China's lockdowns. So I want to echo something mentioned by the previous presenter about the sticky gender notion. I would say I also found the same thing, and sometimes even they do share the connotation of gender still hovering there. So some background. In early 2020, China hit the pause button on daily life. The country's stringent lockdowns didn't just keep people home, they also put work on hold. Unlike in most countries where telework was an option, China's lockdowns, which were the first in the world, coincided with the Spring Festival holiday, a time when businesses and factories are usually shut down. For weeks, people had no jobs to go to, no commutes, and no excuses about being too busy for housework. You think this would lead to a more equal division of labor or chores, right? After all, one of the most common reasons people avoid housework is like, I don't have time. But that's not what happened. So I surveyed about 1,700 people and conducted 100 interviews to see how housework labor was actually divided during this period. The result, well, men did step up in one area, which is grocery shopping. But why? Because under the wartime style lockdown, grocery shopping took on a new meaning. With movement restricted, shopping became a strategic task requiring bravery, responsibility, mobility, and strength, qualities traditionally associated with masculinity. This temporary shift in how grocery shopping was perceived allowed men to participate without challenging their gender identity. Meanwhile, their contributions to cooking, cleaning, and laundry actually decreased. In multi-generational households, older family members didn't take on more responsibilities either. Instead, the burden of housework often fell on adult daughters or daughters-in-law. So why did this happen? I looked at it through the lens of doing gender theory. Even though men and women both had more free time, women, especially those who work full-time ended up doing even more housework. And it wasn't just because they were available. Several factors played a role. First, many believed women were simply better at housework, making it harder to delegate tasks to men. Second, even when women wanted to delegate, it was often difficult, either because of the family expectations or because it felt easier to just do things themselves. Third, with workloads reduced, women naturally absorbed more household responsibilities for the sake of specialization, reinforcing the traditional gender roles. So here's a back here. Here's a key takeaway. Men's participation in housework didn't just depend on having free time. It depended on whether a task aligned with their idea of masculinity. The pandemic context in China temporarily altered the gender label of grocery shopping, turning it into a task where men could demonstrate competence under crisis. This brief masculinization led to a rise in the domestic participation, but only in that specific area. So China's pandemic lockdowns gave us a very rare chance to see what happens when work and time pressures disappear. And what we saw was clear: gender norms, not just economic factors, still dictate who does what at home, even when all else is equal. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much for broadening our horizons past the US. And in that same spirit, our next presenter is Chirong Tsai. Am I pronouncing that right? From the University of Texas, who's going to talk about whether dual families were both working remotely, whether we can treat those as kind of an equal situation, or whether there actually were important gender differences in what remote work looked like from the point of view of the partners in a couple.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Jerry and WFRN for this special issue and this virtual talk. So this research looks at the thickness of the gender division of labor through a spatial lens. I ask how heterosexual couples arrange space when they work from home together during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this research draws on in-depth interviews conducted in Taipei, Taiwan during the summer of 2023. So there are two major findings. The first one is about space. Given Taipei's limited housing space, most families do not have a home office set up for remote work. Under this condition, I found that contrary to previous literature on Western context, not the majority of men in my sample worked in an independent space at home. So some men work in an open spaces such as living room or dining room, where their wives work in the bedroom, and independent physical space, typically considered a more suitable working environment. However, what's interesting about this finding is that an independent physical space did not necessarily guarantee women an uninterrupted work environment. So while I found that while women work from home with their children, their social roles as mothers, wives, and daughters took precedence over their roles as workers. This was the result of the gender expectations and behaviors of other family members. For example, their children ignored their father, who sat in the living room, and went to knock on their mother's door when they needed attention. Or grandparents who were taking care of the working couple's children usually turned to the mother to help and not the father, regardless of the space and the jobs the couple had. In conclusion, my research shows that the expectations of gender roles transcended the physical settings and this remote work setting. Remote working mothers were more interrupted than remote working fathers, even when they were both at home and even if they had help. These interruptions made it hard for women to focus on work and led to some women in my sample to take parental leave during the pandemic because they needed to work from home. That's the ironic result. So this research urges us to critically examine how remote work affects the gender division of labor at home and under what conditions it hinders rather than helps women. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And so that's so we get a sense that the COVID experience really varied. In some places there was a lockdown. In some places people were working remotely. Dual work often kind of created an equal situation for mothers and fathers, but it often didn't in particular circumstances. So that concludes our first section on the gender division of housework. But there are important other changes in family dynamics that occurred during the COVID period. And the next 4 papers focus not so much on the division of labor, although that's always implicated, but rather on other factors such as relationship satisfaction, stress, the ability of families to work remotely, not work remotely in terms of working at the workplace, but be families kind of in remote locations. So our next presenter is Barbara Rissman, who's going to be presenting on a paper called Enforced Togetherness, Change in Continuity and Relationship Satisfaction Among Parents During the COVID-19 Pandemic.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, okay. Oh, well, first of all, I want to say thanks to Jerry for organizing this and bringing us all together, and also for all the work of editing a special journal, and also to WFRN for making this possible. I want to start by introducing my co-authors, who are actually the co-equal first authors, and they are here with us, Marnie Fritz, who's a graduate student at UIC, and Se-Jin, who's a graduate student at NYU. So I hope that as we get to the question and answers, that they will step up with me and answer any questions that you have. As Jerry said, although the issues of division of labor and equity are very important in any study of households, we asked a different question, and that was, what is the consequences of what we call all the enforced togetherness during COVID for couple relationships and satisfaction? Because one of the things that we all experience, but I don't think there's a lot of attention to, is if you were a partnered person, you spent a lot of time with your partner, much more than you usually would. And so we really wanted to know what the effect of that was. These are part of the same data of the same larger project that you heard about that Kathleen just mentioned. So very quickly, I do want to say a little bit about the data, but what we did was we added questions to a North Amerispeak panel and asked people if they were caregivers, would they be willing to speak with us? So that way we had a kind of national sample. And also I think it's important for this research that the time frame matters. We did this almost 1.5 years into the pandemic. So the kind of quick, radical disruptions, people were used to them. You know, they had time to reflect and think about how their changes. So we're talking about couple relationships here, but I want to be clear, we didn't talk to couples. We talked to individual people and asked them about their relationships. So this is not dyadic couple data, which sometimes gets confusing. So we talked to 32 men and 26 women. They were between the ages of 26 and 61 with a mean age of 39. 70% were white, and the other 30% were a wide variety of different races and ethnicities. they all lived with partners and they all were raising children. They were all heterosexual as well. And most, but not all, were married. About 90% were married. And so I think the group, what's really interesting is that the majority told, over half, told us that the relationships actually improved during COVID, and the experience of forced togetherness actually increased the quality of their relationships. And they talked about two main ways in which that was. The first was they had time to do leisure activities together. They could figure out what it was they wanted to do and actually spend time doing it together. They also talked about having time to effectively communicate together, to actually talk about things and work things out. In 8 of these households, they actually mentioned such communication led to more egalitarian divisions of labor. But I think what the commonality was in both of those conversations was the word time. You know, the time itself was what they talked about. There were 11 people who told us their relationship quality decreased, 8 women and 3 men. Nearly all of these people talked at least some about the unequal division of household labor affecting the quality of their relationships. This was what I thought was sort of interesting here, was this was even true for very traditional couples where the women, solo earner couples where the women had always done more, but during the course of COVID, what you had to do increased so much. And so that even in traditional settings, that these people talked about kind of 2 patterns. Either they distanced and tried, even though they were together, just to be emotionally distant and not talk very much, or they had very intense disagreements and arguments. And then about 1/3 of the people stayed the same and said that they didn't really change what they did very much from before the pandemic. So what do I think of these implications for this going forward, or what we think, because of course, it's not a sole authored paper. I think there's 2 levels. At the psychological level for couples themselves, or maybe for people who work with couples, therapists, the items that seem most important to improving relationships that people mentioned in any case was enjoying joint leisure activities and effective communication. Those were the 2 things that people identified as having increased the quality of their relationships, and of course they had time to do it. In terms of social policy or work-family issues, what we came through loud and clear was in pre-pandemic times, couples didn't have time. They did not have enough time to have the kind of quality relationships and family lives they wanted. And so that, you know, the unintended and certainly silver lining to a very bad, obviously, situation in a bigger macro level was that they had that time. And that we have, again, the kind of flexibility in work that gives people more time to have quality family life, whether it's where they work, how flexible, the time flexibility, anything that can increase the time people can spend in their family lives is going to increase their satisfaction and of their relationships. So that's it.
Terrific. Thanks, Barbara. So the good news is some couples are getting along better. The next paper is going to bring us back down again and focus on stress. And the authors are Wen Fan and Phyllis Mohn, and I think Wen Fan is going to be presenting, and from Boston College. And I think you have slides that you wanted to share. So I don't know what you need to do to get this to share your screen. Thanks. We can see it now. Go right ahead.
Okay, perfect. Great. So thank you everyone for attending the session, and thanks Jerry in particular for putting together on this fantastic special issue, and WFRN for making this happen. So as Jerry mentioned, I'm Wen, and the paper that I'm going to sharing with you is a collaboration with Phyllis. So the motivation for this study stems from the seemingly contradictory narratives and findings we observed in media and academic research, including work by many on this panel or in the audience. So that is, on one hand, most workers, we know that they appreciate and value remote work deeply. So survey after survey reveals that many workers are willing to forego pay raises to retain the option to work remotely. On the other hand, it's also undeniable that many parents were struggling when working from home, to the extent that some social observers even argue that working from home may have hurt the mental health of parents in particular. So how do we reconcile these contradictions? So we believe that the missing piece, or at least one missing piece in this contradiction, is that the pandemic brought multiple changes simultaneously. So alongside the sudden transition to remote work for many whose jobs would allow it, was the sudden transition to remote schooling. So any discussion about the impacts of remote work during the pandemic, we think would be incomplete if we do not simultaneously consider the role of remote school. So that is the key research question we try to address. So we take this relationship between our work location and well-being. So we use what we call work-life tensions to measure people's well-being. But the key focus is really about the role of school closure policies in this relationship, to see that whether the well-being benefits of remote work may have obscured because of the school closure policies. And equally importantly, we want to look at whether this relationship differs between women and men at the intersections of gender and race ethnicity, because we know that parenting norms vary quite widely across these social groups. So to study this, we use remote work dynamics panel study. So this is a study Phyllis and I, we have been collecting data since the beginning of the pandemic. So this is a nationally representative sample of individuals who worked remotely during COVID in the United States. So in addition to this survey, we merged the school closure measure from Oxford COVID-19 government response tracker. So we know for each state and for each day what happened in terms of remote school policies. So this is our key finding, and the main finding is consistent with our hypothesis that school closures indeed weakened the well-being benefits of remote or hybrid work. So here we look at predicted values of mothers' work-life tensions. And on the left, you can see that when schools were not required to close, so when schools were open during the pandemic, remote working mothers reported lower levels of work-life tensions or lower stress compared with mothers who work in person. But the opposite pattern emerged when we look at states or time when schools were required to close. So in this case, remote working is associated with higher levels of work-life tensions compared with in-person working. So it's important to note that this finding is only observed among mothers. We do not find this to be the case for non-parents nor fathers. So indicating that conventional gender norms with mothers being the default caregivers remain strong, at least in the US during the pandemic, which is consistent with many other studies. And when we look at the intersection by gender and race, then the pattern is most pronounced among white mothers, as you can see here, this contrary pattern depending on school closure context. So again, this is in line with previous studies that the intensive parenting, intensive mothering ideology and the gender division of domestic labor seems to be most pronounced among white parents. So the key takeaway message is that the positive well-being effects of remote work seem to have obscured during the pandemic by the countervailing effects of school closures. And this is especially the case for mothers or white mothers in particular. So when we think about post-pandemic, when schools are open these days, then remote hybrid work should be considered a crucial resource for improving parental well-being. And the mandatory office returns we have seen over the past few years, the few months in particular, may increase some parental stress. But it's also important to know that remote work is not the magic bullet that will solve everything. The key lesson another key lesson we learned is that enhanced childcare support is also necessary for parents to receive the maximum benefits from remote work. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Fascinating results and concisely presented. I'm going to skip out of order just a little bit. So much of what we focused on here has been on couples who are together in the same place, but not all families. One of the things that happened during COVID was families who are not all located in the same place or had even more difficulty in supporting one another. And so that issue is addressed by Rianka Roy and her co-authors in a paper called We Cannot Go There. So take it away, Rianka.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm trying to share my slides, but it's saying that sharing is not turned on. I don't know if anyone from the network can help me with that.
Give it a shot now.
Okay. Yeah, I can do it now. Thank you. So our research was based on a larger project on migrant precarity in the US and India during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the research was funded by the Social Science Research Council. But in this paper, we actually focus on the US data based on some interviews. So in this paper, my co-authors and we studied how Indian immigrants in the US who are high skilled, highly educated, and high income, so how they navigated their caregiving and care receiving practices within their families during the pandemic. So we studied a relatively privileged immigrant group because Asian Indians currently represent the wealthiest minority in the US. And as I said, that most of them are highly educated. Around 80% of them have college degrees. So that means they had the resources to maintain transnational ties with their family members in India. So they could afford the digital technologies using which they could keep in touch regularly. And also under normal circumstances, it was expected that they could travel regularly internationally to visit their family members in India. And these immigrants are also documented, so meaning they had the required papers and the visas to make those international travels. And also under the family reunification system in US immigration laws, they are allowed to, so these immigrants that we studied, they were allowed to bring their spouses and children and form families in the US. But when we used the pandemic as a lens, when most of these international travels were not possible anyway, we discovered that not just during the pandemic, but also in other times, these immigrants actually struggled to give and receive care to and from their family members. Because for them, family did not just mean spouses and children. So that's how the US immigration laws narrowly defines families for immigrants. But for them, family also meant parents and grandparents and adult children and siblings. So several of them continue to live in India. So we interviewed Asian Indian immigrants in 3 different categories or stages of their immigration in the US. So 17 of them were temporary visa holders. So some were students, some were workers on H-1B visas or OPT visas or L-1 visas. 3 of our interviewees were permanent residents or green card holders, and 13 were US citizens already. And we found that all of them face various challenges, some more, some less, particularly during the pandemic, to maintain a balance between their professional responsibilities in the US and care obligations, both in the US and India. So based on this data, we developed a concept called dispersed care, and this is how we define dispersed care, that it refers to the practices of dividing and allocating care responsibilities among the multiple fragments of immigrant families in home and host countries amid state-imposed barriers to family reunification. So we found that these immigrants struggled to maintain their legal, within quotes, of course, and documented status as immigrants. So the temporary immigrants especially could not travel to India whenever they had to, because of mostly not just the travel bans or the travel restrictions during pandemic, but more so because of the travel restrictions because of their visa status. The permanent residents and US citizens were in a slightly better position, but they also faced certain economic hardships. And also, of course, there was a gendered expectation and the gendered division of labor of care work in the families. So we discussed these findings under mainly 3 themes. So economic vulnerabilities, that how these immigrants tried to prioritize their professional responsibilities, and that led to some sort of neglect to their care responsibilities in their families. Then we discussed deeply the gendered impact on the division of care work. And finally, we also discussed isolation and anxiety among immigrants in the US in the context of dispersed care. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to take it, but I'm concluding the presentation here.
Thanks so much. So we've been focused so much on remote work, and we're reminded by this paper that there is also remote care in many different facets, not only for immigrant families, but for families in all so many other circumstances. The last paper on this family-focused segment of our discussion of the special issue is called Contrasting Conceptions of Work-Family Balance, that Kathleen Gerson is going to be presenting.
And Kathleen, I think you're muted.
Down. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
And I had such a nice introduction. I'll have to start over. Sorry, Jerry. Thank you for telling me. So I'm back again, this time unmuted, and this paper will also report on findings from this collaborative project that Jerry, Barbara Rissman, Jennifer Glass, who will be speaking later, and I put together to try to understand the pandemic. In this case, the paper, the first authors are graduate students Sejin and Ku and Carrie Waldrop, all of whom are here today, and would be wonderful to hear from them in the Q&A if we have some time to speak to this. This paper takes a very different approach than one that honestly I had even thought about before, which was to focus on the concept of work-family balance, which has been important in the scholarly literature, but almost taken for granted in terms of how people think about it. So the paper asked, how did couples define work-family balance, and to what extent and in what ways did their definitions of balance shape their experiences during the pandemic? Did that affect how they responded and their level of satisfaction with that response? Again, this is based on interviews with 88 heterosexual partners. Almost 2/3 of them were dual earner or women breadwinner households, where the actual division of breadwinning was either equal or even more so on women's shoulders. The rest were about equally divided between both couples in which the woman worked part-time, or it was a sort of a traditional homemaker breadwinner household. So at the outset, we asked people at the outset, what were their views on work-family balance? How did they define it in terms of their own experiences? And here we found three different conceptions. The first is one I think that most scholars assume is how everyone defines it, which is work-family balance is an individual responsibility. We measure it in terms of individual experiences of how they put these dual commitments together. And almost 2/3 of the women did define work-family balance that way, a minority of men, but almost a quarter of them also did. But what the surprising thing is that we also found that that many people saw balance as a couple-centered task and framework rather than an individual one. Now, this group can be divided into two different subcategories, which are very different. The first is the more traditional view that balance means she's responsible for the home and domestic work. I'm responsible for breadwinning. And then if we help out a little bit in the other spheres, that's okay. But the responsibility is on the shoulders of one member of the partnership, divided by gender. But another definition of work-family balance, and that, by the way, more men than women expressed that view, almost 40% of men, whereas only about slightly more than 15% of women. The third view, again, is this smaller group who saw balance in egalitarian terms, that it's not enough to have personal balance, but it's also important that that balance extends to the relationship, so that each member of the partnership is contributing their fair share to those activities. We would call that egalitarian, and many of them did. Here we've got a small group, but a quarter of the men and well over 15% of women also define balance in egalitarian terms. So then the question that follows is, to what extent did these frameworks that people began with as the pandemic emerged and proceeded, to what extent did that shape their satisfaction with their experiences of the pandemic? And to what extent did their framework shift as a result? Now, we did not find, again, and I think this is becoming a theme, that there wasn't a great deal of shift in the framework, but there were differences in how those frameworks informed people's sense of satisfaction and about what happened during the pandemic. Individual conceptions, for example, women were more likely than men who had this conception to experience a change in their level of satisfaction, including a decline in their level of satisfaction, suggesting, which we must infer, that when the onus was on one person, they felt more responsibility to adjust their lives in these changed circumstances. In contrast, the specialization conception had more effect on men than women, in the sense that women were more likely to maintain their satisfaction because it didn't have as great a change on their prior responsibilities. But for traditional men, it challenged the kind of division of labor that they had taken for granted and that they saw as the right way and the fair way, the natural way to organize their lives. Among those with egalitarian conceptions, satisfaction was high before, and largely persisted throughout the pandemic, and in that case, over 3/4 of women and even more men remained or became more satisfied during the pandemic. And I think this suggests that even though the load of work increased with the pandemic, it didn't upset the general framework for organizing the apportionment of that load. And so sort of getting back to to Barbara's work on togetherness, it didn't cause, they experienced it together. They were in it together. They had that framework going into it, and it helped them get through it. So I do think there are two important implications of this study that I certainly had not thought about before we did it. The first is that it's important for us, I think, as scholars and researchers, to begin to think about how different groups of people define what they mean by balance. If that's become such a watchword in our society, then we really need to unpack it, because it's not a unitary conception, it varies. And I think the pandemic may not have changed that, but it did reveal these differences that were not so obvious before. The second, I think, implication is that because it did provide a framework that shaped couples' experiences during the pandemic, it tells us that egalitarian conceptions may be, and frameworks may be especially well suited to help people weather unexpected challenges and circumstances when they arise, as we know they will. Because even as new challenges arose, there was a sense of fairness and sharing and how those challenges would be met. So just to conclude, I think it's worth all of us, even though the changes during the pandemic were not great, what was revealed here that can change our ways of doing our research is to take account of these diverse conceptualizations and of how people understand work-family balance, and how they use those conceptions both to organize and to justify their own personal arrangements in the 21st century.
Thank you. So now we're going to shift gears to focus on work. We've been talking about work and family and gender. The focus so far has been on various aspects of family issues. The last 4 papers are going to focus on work. The first one is going to be presented by Jennifer Glass, and that focuses on preferences for remote and hybrid work. So take it away, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I want to thank my equal co-authors, Carolyn Waldrop and Marnie Fritz, for joining me on this paper. And we centered our analysis on one question: did the rapid and widespread adoption of remote work arrangements influence worker preferences? And our study is using the same interview data that Kathleen and Barbara have already presented. We isolated the 52 participants, 20 men and 32 women, in dual earner households with children who had remote work experience, but we also asked everybody whether they had remote work experience or not if they wanted to work remotely. And I'll get to the punchline very quickly. Unless their jobs were poorly suited to remote work, and I'll say more about that in a minute, most workers with pandemic-era remote work opportunities, and even some who did not have access to remote work during the pandemic, wish to keep remote access in some form post-pandemic, at minimum in hybrid form 1 or 2 days a week. These respondents reported enhanced job satisfaction and productivity from remote work, and they tied this to greater schedule control and flexibility in their workday. Now, some of these workers had worked remotely before, but 3/4 of the workers who worked remotely during the pandemic who had caregiving responsibilities had not worked remotely at all before. So I want to give you a quick couple of sample quotes. This is a white mother of 2 who worked as an administrator. "I feel like the pandemic really just showed that there are a lot of opportunities where it benefits people to work from home. You can get as much or more out of your employees. It's not just flexibility for parents, but any type of family member, or maybe your own personal health. There's just so many reasons why this remote work could be super beneficial for many employees across a wide variety of industries." And this is the white father of a teen who works in IT support. "I love it. My concentration is better. I'm not interrupted constantly during my day. I can take my daughter to practice, pick her up, and then come back and continue to work until I meet my work obligation. I think I work slightly more, but that's just because that's my choice, you know?" And here's someone who realizes that she's probably not going to be able to continue to work remotely, but wants hybrid. This is a woman who says, "I think a day or 2 a week would be really nice just to work from home and be able to focus without any kind of office distractions. I think I'd be more productive. But then in other senses, I would miss out on some of the important conversations that happen, but it would be a good trade, at least a day or two a week or something. And this is a father, Ethan. I feel like communication is much more difficult in general with my coworkers from home. And because I don't talk to them randomly as much, if I don't schedule a meeting for something in particular, I don't learn about something. So I just feel like I have less context. Now, those who were told to return to work after this large expression of support for hybrid work had three types of responses. Because remember, we were already a year and a half into the pandemic and continued until the summer when it was basically over. The first was that they felt annoyed, but they acquiesced in order to keep their jobs. There were enough other good features about their jobs that they wanted to remain. Some negotiated, in particular, for schedule control and flexibility because they were too important to lose if they were going to stay. And some quit rather than return in person full-time. Some quit the workforce altogether, and some found new remote work jobs. And some who hadn't had to make a decision yet anticipated quitting if they were forced to go back full-time in the workplace. Now, I am adding this for Wen Fan because in our interviews, some of our respondents specifically mentioned and bracketed the fact that school closings made remote work hard for them. But they were able to see that once schools reopened, it would be great to work remotely. So they were actually more interested in remote work once they saw that this would be a perfect arrangement if only their children were not around. Now, all of this was true for the jobs that we called teleworkable, but there were some jobs that simply were not compatible with remote work, and virtually none of these folks wanted to continue remote work. They were anxious to return in person. We call these unteleworkable jobs, jobs like teaching or physical therapy, and they had similar characteristics. They involved the transfer of skills between individuals, and that transfer could not fully occur via communications technology. So here are a couple of quotes from these folks. This is from a physical therapist. When the pandemic started, we had to go remote. And as a physical therapist, it's kind of difficult to do remote. So I did that for the rest of the school year. And then I decided to quit because number one, it's just too difficult. And here's the wife of a teacher. I remember trying to get the kids up and fed breakfast. And there's us while he, meaning her husband, is back there Zooming. And just him staring at a sea of black boxes. Or like when they had to turn on their cameras, they would have all their cameras facing the ceiling. He'd try to crack jokes. They saw how hard he was trying to engage with people over a video. He was really trying to knock it out of the park. But I feel like the job for him has just gotten harder and harder. So I'm going to leave you with some conclusions. Clearly, our employed remote workers who were dual earner households with children felt that they were more productive. We are seeing remote work heavily politicized in the current moment. And there's a strong debate, ongoing debate, between employer and employee perceptions of productivity. And this is going to remain a very vital research question that more attention needs to be paid to. The upshot, though, is that worker preferences are very, very clear. This is a pro-worker and pro-family policy, and the vast majority who are exposed to this want to continue it. So thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. The next two papers are about academics and a fascinating contrast. Sarah Tebo is going to talk about an American case, and then our Italian friends are going to talk about many similar issues, but not entirely a comparable situation in Italian academics. So let's turn to Sarah Tebo.
Great. Thanks, Jerry, for organizing this conference and for the special issue. It's really fun to hear everyone else's papers because I think they really are in conversation with one another. So first, just want to say thank you to my co-authors, my two graduate students, Charlotte Hoppen and Jen David, and also Eileen Boris, who's my colleague at UCSB in Feminist Studies. Okay, so our study builds off of a lot of this literature here about the COVID crisis and its gender differentiated impacts on employment, caregiving, and mental health. So we zoomed in on faculty as a case of professional workers that were dealing with the shift to remote work and the loss of the care infrastructure. So as many of you know, the culture as well as the organization and the structure of work tasks in academia already lend themselves to overwork. And then with the transition to remote teaching and pandemic-related service demands, faculty workloads increased dramatically at the same time that caregiving loads also increased with the loss of childcare, remote schooling, the increased frequency of physical illness, and also mental health challenges among family members etc. So given all of this, we wanted to measure and unpack how this intense and also long-term time crunch shaped gender inequality in terms of caregiving, both in terms of time spent and in terms of qualitative experiences, mental health outcomes, especially stress, and then perceptions of institutional support from the university. So we analyzed both quantitative and qualitative open-ended responses from a May 2021 campus-wide survey of faculty at a large US research university on the West Coast. The response rate for the faculty sample was 46%, which was pretty good, actually. Importantly, at the time of the survey, schools and childcare facilities had only recently reopened in our setting, and in-person instruction at the university had not yet resumed. So meaning that faculty were, at the point of the survey, in their 15th month of experiencing a crisis of work and care. So our main findings, so the quantitative part, so we kind of started off by analyzing gender gaps in reported time spent on professional work, housework, and caregiving, accounting for several factors like care for children attending remote school, the presence of a partner in the household, and job characteristics like academic rank, discipline, age, and race ethnicity. Our findings show that quantitatively, at least, women faculty were really overloaded. So they were maintaining professional and housework activities on par with men, but they were simultaneously taking on substantially more caregiving than men, than their male colleagues, you could say. So between 6 and 9 hours more per week. The women faculty also reported much higher levels of work-family related stress and were far less likely to feel supported by their institution. Perhaps not surprisingly, these issues were really exacerbated for faculty who had remote schooling obligations or who had a child under the age of 5. Then we conducted analyses to further assess what accounts for women's higher stress levels. And these findings suggested that the gap emerged not merely because women were experiencing more substantial increase in caregiving hours, but also because they perceived this lack of support from the university community and its policies. So then we turned to these qualitative open-ended, we did a content analysis of these open-ended survey responses, and we had quite a bit of data there. And this really helped us develop a more detailed understanding what was really happening. So first, women faculty were substantially more vulnerable to work interruptions and unpredictability. And they also took on more of the mental and emotional labor involved in ensuring their children's well-being. So for instance, several women, but none of the men, described instances of interruptions occurring during live work meetings, teaching sessions, or faculty meetings, which meant that women also had to more frequently navigate colleagues' reactions to such interruptions, like expressing gratitude when colleagues were understanding or forgiving. They were also more likely to be kind of on the front lines of caregiving, so to speak. So since they more frequently described just converting their work hours spontaneously to care when unexpected demands came up. And this was not a pattern for the male faculty. Okay, a second thing was that the vast majority of women faculty used extreme terms to describe their overall situation, and many reported mental health challenges, ranging from anxiety to burnout to guilt to a lack of motivation. Mothers were also more likely to express these feelings with a palpable sense of anger at the situation and to describe their mental health as resulting from their concerns about or their direct managing of their children's well-being. So one mother simply wrote, "Mental energy gets spent on children's well-being." Another said, "I don't have the mental bandwidth to spend all day teaching on Zoom and supervising 2 kids learning from home, Zoom, and then be creative. My children have suffered learning loss and the older is depressed and unmotivated. Under these circumstances, research/creative work takes a backseat." Finally, a critical piece to this story is that women attributed these mental health experiences to the university's unwillingness to make workload modifications accessible. So in fact, the majority of women who responded to the open-ended question stated outright that the university had done nothing helpful for them at all. Indeed, many noted that they just wanted their time back and that motivation and modifications like stronger TA support, course release, or subsidies for private childcare costs would have made a huge difference. But in this case, the university made it difficult to access the few modifications that were available, like short-term leaves. And in many cases, respondents explained that such modifications would not necessarily have helped their situation. One mother said, nothing has been offered that helped me in the moment. All the help, all the quote unquote help, has been extremely difficult to access. And that just gave me, and then all in caps, more stress and stole more of my time, also all in caps. And it's really important to note that the mental health resources that were offered by the university were really irrelevant to these faculty. One woman explained, "I appreciate all the workshops and resources related to mental health and self-care. However, at this point, I'm too tired to attend those. People with caregiving responsibilities are fighting for some more minutes and don't have much time or mental space for these resources. What could be directly helpful is a course release to offset the lost time." So overall, our study contributes empirical evidence to the growing and important body of research on caregivers in the academy, and to the broader body of work that demonstrates how gendered caregiving dynamics shape mental health and remote work experiences, and how the reliance on individual solutions to balancing work and family has failed even relatively privileged workers. It also reveals how university and academic structures and policies are fundamentally ill-equipped to respond to crises that disproportionately affect workers with caregiving responsibilities. So we're hoping that our findings will help highlight the need to reform and innovate in university policies and practices so that better systems can be put in place before the start of the next crisis of care. Thanks.
Thank you. Turning to an Italian comparison case, is Anna Carreri, Manuela Naldini, and Alessia Tuselli presenting their study. Will be Anna?
Yes.
Very
Hi.
good.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for organizing this amazing event that gives the visibility to the special issue. I will present our article on behalf of my co-authors, Manuela Naldini, who is here with us, and Alessia Tuselli. Our paper is focused on academic work and on the experiences of academics in Italy during the pandemic and lockdowns. Although the research has been extensive regarding this sector, I mean the higher education sector, it has focused more on the widening of the motherhood penalty, while other groups of academics are still blurred. Even more under-investigated and not yet fully explained are the intersections between further axes of diversity. This happens often because the research conducted during the pandemic in Italy was based on a small volume of in-depth data. On the opposite, we could draw on extensive in-depth interview data. We have a highly heterogeneous sample of 127 Italian academics from a wider national research project, which is called Gender in Academia, and was coordinated by Manuela Naldini. So we tried to make a contribution to the scientific debate by adopting an intersectional approach, and specifically in investigating daily working life and work-life balance during the pandemic. Our article sheds light on how gender combines with other axes of asymmetry. They are the social class, which is understood as the comparison between precarious academics and stable career positions. And the third axis of asymmetry is the age, or as we call it, the individual's life course stage. So basically, we look at how the intersection between gender, class, and individual's life course stage produces specific conditions of advantage or disadvantage for some academics. And the analysis reveals 3 household and family life course types that embody the interlocking of the 3 axes with unequal and possibly long-term consequences for the quality of working life, well-being, and also the careers of academics. They are first, those participants who were living alone or with parents. Second, those who were in couples without children or with grown-up children. And third, those couples with young children and other family members in need of care. So to conclude, the intersectional approach allowed us to complexify the analysis and show the heterogeneity of lived experiences And just to give you a few examples, we show in the article different nuances of the motherhood penalty phenomenon, leading to different outcomes. In the case of advanced career academics, so I mean among associate professors, we observed that the pandemic forced the mothers of young children to postpone research activities in order to devote themselves to other aspects of academic work, mainly teaching and service work. So basically, they felt physically and mentally exhausted and took into consideration of slowing their career progression. Instead, for those in unstable and precarious positions, we observed that the difficulties of being as productive as their peer group and meeting the expectation of scientific mentors made young mothers consider giving up their careers. So the social class is very important as it exposes mothers differently to the neoliberal culture of productivity with different personal outcomes depending on the individual's life course stage as well. Moreover, in several cases, both men and women with certain characteristics were able to, so to speak, to benefit from the pandemic by adhering to the model of the ideal academic, which is a model that entails working non-stop, we know that, in order to increase scientific productivity. They were men and women alike who lived alone or with their parents, for whom the home became a single, very productive place. They could optimize time, gain time, as they told us. And finally, and surprisingly, there were also those who had emotional benefits and advantages in terms of well-being during the pandemic. These were both men and women who lived with a partner, but without caring responsibilities, so without children, especially those whose living conditions allow them to have a good control over their own space, which is a condition that we know is related to social class. So similar to what Barbara Risman told us earlier, working from home made it possible, as they said, to free up time for oneself and for the couple relationship. And these are my conclusions, so thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, grazie. Last but certainly not least, Yasmin Mertahikian is going to be presenting to us on women's labor force participation in Argentina and how that evolved over the course of the pandemic.
Thanks, Jerry. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, there's something in front of it.
There?
Very good, very good.
And I'm sorry, my connection has been a little bit unstable today, so hopefully I'll be able to go through the presentation. Thanks, Jerry, for putting together this special issue and organizing this conference to discuss our papers further. And I want to thank my co-author, Emilio Parrado, as well. In this paper, we aim to evaluate the impact of the pandemic on the labor market in Argentina, both in the short and long term. To do so, we focused on gender inequalities and the role played by the public and private employment sectors in this process. Why focus on the public sector? The public sector has traditionally been highly gendered across Latin America and particularly in Argentina. It has historically played a key role in fostering women's labor market inclusion, but it's important to note that access to public sector employment is not the same as the private sector, as public sector jobs often offer less favorable working conditions than the formal private sector. Thus, our goal was to analyze how the pandemic affected the labor market, emphasizing not only gender differences, but also distinctions between the public and private sectors. To do this, we used data from Argentina's permanent household survey from the last quarter of 2019 to the fourth quarter of 2021, focusing on individuals of working age, and our dependent variable was employment status. What did we find? In general, our findings reveal recovery patterns during the pandemic, both in the short and long term, where gender differences interacted with employment sector dynamics. In the immediate impact of the pandemic, there was a sharp increase in activity levels for both men and women. However, as the economy began to recover, men tended to regain their labor force participation at a higher rate than women. A key explanation for this trend lies in the sectors driving the recovery. Men were more likely to reintegrate into the labor market due to their faster re-entry into both the formal private sector and the informal sector. In contrast, women faced greater challenges re-entering these sectors and relied more on the public sector for employment, retention, and reintegration. In other words, our findings suggest that the public sector served as a more stable employment option and reintegration mechanism for women, whereas other economic sectors generally facilitated men's re-entry into the labor market more effectively. And this result aligns with existing literature on the public sector critical role as an employer for women in Latin America in general and Argentina in particular. I'm sorry I lost you. I told you that my internet connection was a little bit weird today. So I'm back to sharing my slides. In this presentation, we aim to extend our analysis to examine the role of different labor markets in Argentina during another economic crisis, specifically the one that began in early 2024. At the end of 2023, Milei assumed office under a right-wing government administration. Given the severe macroeconomic challenges facing the country, the government implemented drastic measures to combat inflation, freezing economic activity through the first half of 2024. Our goal is to assess whether in this new economic crisis, under a government with a different ideological orientation from the center-left pro-state administration of Alberto Fernandez before, the role of public sector employment remained the same or changed under this right-wing administration. Here we are presenting employment status percentages, adding to our table in the paper the first 2 quarters of 2024, which are the most recent available data for Argentina. Our findings indicate that for men, informal employment experienced a slight increase compared to the pre-pandemic period, mirroring a similar rise in the formal private sector. But there were no differences between the pre-pandemic period and the first 2 quarters of 2024 regarding public sector employment. For women, alongside an increase in both informal and formal private sector employment, public sector employment also rose. When we analyze whether these differences between quarters are statistically significant, we find that similar to what we observed during the pandemic, there is a significant difference in public sector employment levels among women, but not among men. In the end, we find that, as was the case during the pandemic, even under a right-wing market-oriented government, the public sector continues to serve as a source of labor stability for women. Both in our paper and in the brief presentation that we are showing today, we find that the formal in Argentina, the right-wing government to support women's employment during economic crisis. However, this analysis does not capture
I think we've been very fortunate. The technologies work pretty well throughout. Yasmin, did you want to try to wrap things up?
Sure.
I'll shot with that, maybe without sharing the screen.
Yes, I'll do that. What I was saying is that both in our paper and in this brief presentation, we find that the formal public sector in Argentina remains highly gendered and has been used by both right and left-wing governments as a mechanism to support women's employment during economic crisis. But in future research, we aim not only to expand our analysis to other economic crises, including the one currently unfolding in Argentina, but also go beyond employment status to examine employment quality across different periods, governments, and gender groups. Thank you, and I'm sorry again for all the technology issues that go beyond me.
We got your, I think we got your point. Thanks to everybody for joining us. I really would love to have an hour of conversation about each of the papers. There's so many rich ideas. Thanks to all the presenters for keeping things brief. You can see from the clock that I wasn't being mean. I was just trying to make sure that we got to all of the papers. And thank you for being concise and for highlighting so many fascinating issues. I'd love to figure out a way we can continue this conversation going forward, because I think the pandemic, while it's in the rear view mirror as far as the public is concerned, I think we continue to feel its effects in many ways, and who's to say we aren't going to have another crisis, maybe it will take a different form of the health crisis or some other kind of crisis that may be emerging soon. So I think it's important for us to try to cull the lessons and figure out what kind of strategies we want to pursue going forward. So thanks again to and congratulations to all the authors and co-authors for contributing to this special issue. Thanks to many friends, old friends and new friends that I see on the screen. So many people from all corners of the US and around the world. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to continuing this conversation.